Revenge dairies with I am.
He laughed. Right in my face, while the entire room watched, pretending it was some kind of joke. I froze. The fluorescent lights of the boardroom reflected off the polished conference table. But nothing could brighten the humiliation burning in my chest. My boss, Greg Holloway, leaned back in his leather chair, smirking like he owned the world. He didn't just mock my proposal. He mocked me. Every careful slide, every late-night hour, every ounce of effort I'd poured into the pitch, all dismissed with a sneering chuckle. I'm Rachel Marks, 28, ambitious and usually calm under pressure. Marketing isn't just my job. It's my battlefield. I thrive on strategy, on precision, on outsmarting challenges. But Greg thinks confidence is a weakness to exploit. He's been my boss for 2 years, charming on the surface but ruthless underneath, the kind of person who smiles while stabbing you in the back. The moment I stepped into this meeting, I should have sensed the trap. Our dynamic was toxic but strangely consistent. I deliver results, he takes credit. I speak up. He undermines me. I've noticed the little things. Emails disappearing, praise rerouted, ideas revised under his name. But I never imagined he'd go this far. Publicly. In front of everyone. As he leaned forward, voice dripping with mockery, I could feel the eyes of my team on me, some awkwardly sympathetic, some clearly entertained by my discomfort. Greg was feeding off it, enjoying every second. He thrived on making others feel small. But that's where he underestimates me. The moment passed, the meeting ended, and everyone shuffled out, murmuring about Greg's legendary humor. But as I packed my laptop, a strange unease settled over me. Something felt off beyond the humiliation. Like I had just glimpsed a door behind which I wasn't supposed to look. There were subtle hints I'd ignored before. Encrypted emails, unexplained absences, whispers from colleagues who clearly feared him. I didn't know it yet, but I had stumbled onto something that could change everything. And that unease, that prickling suspicion in the back of my mind, was the spark. The spark that would soon turn humiliation into calculated, unstoppable revenge. Because Greg Holloway doesn't know the fire he just lit. The humiliation in the boardroom still clung to me like a second skin. I kept replaying Greg's sneer, the way he leaned back as if he owned not just the room but my entire career. I forced myself to breathe, to compartmentalize, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. Something about him had always felt off, but now, after that meeting, the feeling grew sharper, more insistent. Red flags had been there all along, subtle and easy to dismiss. The first was the favoritism. Greg had a select group of employees he praised publicly, giving them the best accounts, the largest budgets, the most visibility. Me? I was capable, but never enough. Every time I turned in a polished report or closed a key client, he'd barely acknowledge it. Meanwhile, someone like Derek, lazy, sarcastic, completely unprepared, got handshakes and praise like clockwork. Then there were the secret calls. At first, I chalked them up to typical executive activity, late-night strategy calls, client negotiations, but the way he ducked into empty offices, whispered hurriedly, and glanced over his shoulder, it set off alarms I tried to ignore. Once, I noticed him deleting texts as soon as he saw me approaching. My gut told me there was more going on than he let on. The lies were harder to pin down but just as dangerous. He'd promise one thing in meetings, then contradict it in private emails. He'd tell me to handle a project a certain way, only for him to present the results as if he'd set the direction. I started keeping notes, screenshots, even tiny voice memos just in case, but it still felt like walking on thin ice. Money was another puzzle. Budget allocations didn't add up. Expense reports seemed inflated. Reimbursements delayed. At first, I assumed corporate inefficiency, but the more I watched, the more I suspected manipulation. Every month, Greg would push for discretion in how I handled client contracts and vendor invoices. Something about it stank, though I couldn't yet put a finger on the exact crime. And then came the unfair treatment, the subtle digs and verbal jabs hidden beneath compliments. "Rachel, impressive effort. For someone at your level," he'd say. "I wouldn't expect you to understand all the complexities, but you did okay." Each phrase was a knife coated in honey, sweet enough to confuse me, sharp enough to wound. I began dreading interactions with him, bracing for the next sarcastic remark, the next quiet insult that undermined me in front of colleagues. The emotional strain started to settle in. Nights were restless. I'd stare at my laptop, reviewing emails, replaying meetings, noticing patterns I hadn't seen before. Anxiety gnawed at me, a constant hum beneath my thoughts. How had I not realized sooner? How had I trusted him, shared my ideas, my proposals, my strategies with someone who made me feel like nothing? At work, my confidence wavered. I second-guessed every presentation, every sentence, every gesture. I wanted to scream at him, confront him, but something about Greg kept me cautious. There was a subtle power in the way he dominated the room, in the way his charm masked cruelty. It wasn't just authority, it was strategy. I realized I had underestimated him before, and underestimating him now could cost me everything. But amid the doubt, another feeling began to grow: curiosity. If Greg's behavior was so calculated, what was he hiding? And why did it make me feel both terrified and strangely alive to wonder? It was a dangerous thought, one I couldn't shake. The more I observed, the more threads I noticed, secrets dangling just out of reach, invisible unless I paid close attention. By the end of the week, the suspicion was a quiet storm inside me. I didn't yet know the full scope of Greg's deception, but I could sense its shape. I felt like a detective in my own life, piecing together fragments of truth from the casual lies, the secret calls, the uneven treatment. And every time I looked at him, casually chatting with Derek or laughing off another small victory at my expense, the fire inside me flickered brighter. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was alert. I was aware. And I knew, even if I couldn't articulate it yet, that I wouldn't be a victim for long. I had always trusted Greg. Not blindly, but enough to believe that professional boundaries meant something. After all, he was my boss, not my enemy, at least that's what I thought. But that illusion shattered the moment I stumbled across the first undeniable proof. It started innocently, or so I thought. I was organizing some old project files on the company server when I noticed an oddly named folder tucked behind a pile of spreadsheets labeled Q4 reports. My curiosity nudged me. Something about the folder screamed hidden. I clicked. Inside were emails. Hundreds of them, but not the boring corporate memos I expected. These emails detailed his manipulation of projects I had worked on, including evidence that he had been deliberately sabotaging my campaigns while taking credit for them. One email from a high-level client contained a note praising Greg for strategically redirecting resources that I knew I had painstakingly arranged. Another email instructed Derek to misrepresent my figures in front of management. I froze. The betrayal cut deeper than mockery ever could. This wasn't just favoritism or petty humiliation. This was deliberate, calculated sabotage. Everything I had worked for, every late night and extra mile, had been twisted into his advantage while I was left looking incompetent. My heart raced, disbelief clawing at me. But the shock didn't end there. Further digging revealed a series of secret emails with financial implications. Greg had been funneling funds meant for departmental projects into offshore accounts under his name. Even worse, some messages hinted that he had been manipulating client contracts, taking commissions that should have gone to the team, including me. I sank into my chair, the office suddenly cold and alien. I had been betrayed by the person I'd spent years respecting, learning from, and even defending in team meetings. Rage began to bubble beneath the initial shock. The kind of anger that keeps you awake at night, that gnaws at your thoughts until you can't ignore it. And yet there was a strange clarity in the chaos. This wasn't a moment for screaming or confrontation. Greg had underestimated me. He assumed humiliation would keep me in line, that mockery was enough to suppress my ambition. But now, seeing the evidence, I realized the tables were turning. He had left traces, digital fingerprints that I could use, patterns of his greed and deceit. The emotional strain was overwhelming. I felt heartbreak at the personal betrayal, anger at the professional manipulation, and a creeping fear of what he might do if he knew I had discovered the truth. And beneath all that was a sharp, quiet thought. I had power he hadn't anticipated. I spent hours going through the emails, taking screenshots, copying threads, and piecing together the puzzle of his deception. Each piece added fuel to the fire inside me. The more I uncovered, the more I understood the scale of his manipulation. Not just against me, but against the whole team. And I realized with chilling clarity that Greg's arrogance was his weakness. By the time I left the office that night, I wasn't just angry, I was awakened. The betrayal had transformed me from a cautious employee into a strategist. The question wasn't whether I could fight back, it was how. How could I ensure that Greg paid for everything he had done? How could I make the mockery, the sabotage, and the betrayal burn as he deserved? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same between us. And Greg Holloway would soon learn that the person he humiliated wasn't just capable of surviving. She was capable of turning his own secrets into his downfall. I told myself I wouldn't let anger be my map. Rage felt good in the moment, but it was strategy that would win this war. The evidence on Greg's server had given me direction. Not an impulse, but a plan. If I wanted to bring him down without blowing my cover, I had to be methodical, surgical, and patient. No teatrix. No mistakes. Step 1. Catalog everything. I spent 2 nights straight extracting threads, saving attachments, and organizing files into folders labeled by type. Sabotage, financials, collusion, witnesses. I encrypted the folder on a thumb drive and hid a copy in my personal cloud under a burner account I'd created months earlier for invoices and freelance work. Something Greg would never suspect I'd use. Every email got a timestamp, a summary, and a cross-reference to people mentioned. The aim was to turn chaos into a file that told a story. Motive, method, and outcome. Step 2. Corroborate with witnesses. Digital proof was powerful, but people made it airtight. I quietly reached out to colleagues I trusted, those who'd been nudged aside or handed crumbs while Greg took the feast. Derek, surprisingly, was shaky in private. He admitted to following instructions to misrepresent figures because he feared Greg's reaction if he refused. An ex-project manager confirmed the offshore transfers had been hinted at in whispered conversations. I recorded consented statements, took screenshots of private messages, and stored them with the emails. Each corroboration reduced the chance this could be written off as a misunderstanding or a rogue misinterpretation. Step 3. Secure the money trail. The financial emails hinted at accounts and shell vendors, but I needed a visible trail. I started tracking expense reports, vendor invoices, and the odd reimbursements Greg approved. I noticed patterns. The same vendor names recurring, slight overpayments, and transactions timed right after major client contracts closed. I used my access to pull public company records and match them to the aliases in the emails. It wasn't forensic accounting yet, but it was enough to show a suspicious flow of funds that demanded scrutiny. Step 4. Design traps, not ambushes. Confrontation would be a trap if it was public and controlled. I drafted scenarios where Greg could prove his innocence in front of HR and legal, and fail. I prepared emails to be discovered by the right eyes. An innocuous file with visible names and a subject line that would catch the attention of compliance if they skimmed it. I scripted a sequence where Derek would have to admit, in a performance review or an audit, that he had been directed to alter figures. The goal was to get the company's internal processes to do the exposing for me, bringing their own investigators into the light. Step 5. Time the leak. Timing would be everything. If I leaked everything too soon, Greg would have time to delete, deny, and deflect. Too late, and he'd bury the evidence or silence witnesses. I identified an upcoming corporate event, an all-hands with external board members where Greg would be lauded for his leadership. That celebration would provide perfect contrast. A public stage where his image was polished while the proof I had could make that shine crack. I made a calendar in my head. Prepare, plant, provoke, reveal. Step 6. Protect myself. I knew the rules of corporate warfare. People who attacked the boss got burned. I anonymized everything I could. Burner emails, staged screenshots, and copies stashed off-site. I fed selective documents to a trusted friend who worked at a law firm, not to litigate immediately but to ask what would look believable to an outside counsel. I set up plausible deniability paths, evidence trails leading away from me if anyone tried to frame the whistleblower as malicious. Throughout the planning, Greg never once showed weakness. He wrote optimistic memos, laughed at team lunches, and smiled in my direction with a predator's calm. He still felt untouchable, and that arrogance was a dangerous asset for him, and my greatest advantage. He believed his mockery and charm had sealed his control. He didn't sense the slow tightening of a net woven from his own words. As the days turned into a rhythm of small, precise moves, my emotional state shifted. The heartbreak and disbelief were still there, smoldering under the plan, but they no longer dictated my actions. They had become fuel. I slept less and thought more clearly. Each new corroboration added a tick to my inner countdown. Each time Greg laughed in a meeting, it felt like a bell he rang before the fall. By the time I had mapped the traps and lined up the witnesses, the plan had a spine. All that remained was to pull the right thread at the right moment and let the corporate machinery, HR, compliance, and public pressure finish the rest. But planning and pulling are different beasts. The moment I chose would determine whether this was a surgical strike or a messy collapse. One late night, sitting with the encrypted folder open and the calendar marked, I realized the strangest thing. I felt no giddy triumph. I felt a cold, steady resolve. The setup was almost complete, and the tension of waiting tightened my chest tighter than any humiliation Greg had ever delivered. The stage was set. The audience didn't know the show had a different ending. Greg was still in control. For now, the all-hands was supposed to be Greg's coronation. Banners with his name hung in the lobby, the board had flown in, and the company live-streamed the whole thing to investors. He strutted onto the stage with the practiced grin of a man who'd never been challenged, the predator all dented little egos feared. I sat in the back row, heart pounding, thumb tight around the encrypted drive in my pocket like a detonator. For months I had sharpened the plan. Tonight I would set it off. Greg began with a joke and the room laughed. He launched into a fireside chat about vision and leadership, and the camera cut to close-ups that would be plastered across the company intranet. I watched his face through the projector light and felt an odd calm. Everything I needed sat in neat folders. Emails showing his sabotage, screenshots of altered reports, vendor invoices matched to shell companies, Derek's recorded admissions, and the financial trail that led to offshore accounts. All of it had been vetted by counsel, time-stamped, and duplicated across secure servers. There was no room for his denials to breathe. Halfway through his speech, when the applause was warm and the crowd relaxed, I stood. The hush that felt unreal. Greg's smile didn't falter. He thought he still controlled the narrative. I walked to the moderator's table and, with practiced neutrality, requested a quick word segment for an internal compliance concern. Murmurs rippled. The moderator, a man who prided himself on placating executives, hesitated. I smiled at him like a colleague, not a conspirator, and handed him an innocuous-looking USB labeled Q4 Audit. He plugged it into the laptop for the slide deck. That was step one of the trap. A file named to beckon compliance with a hidden payload that would do the rest. The projector blinked, and suddenly the sleek presentation shifted. Instead of graphs and buzzwords, the first slide read, "Confidential internal threads, Greg Holloway." A hush swallowed the room. The livestream audio picked it up. On the big screen, email after email unfurled. Subject lines, timestamps, and directives where Greg explicitly instructed Derek to adjust figures and minimize Rachel's role. The camera panned to the board, whose smile stiffened into puzzled frowns. The audience watched in real time as the narrative rewrote itself. Greg's laugh died slow. He stood pale, hands curling into fists. He tried to speak, tried to call it a hack, a prank, but the next slide showed bank transfers, vendor invoices, and screenshots of messages confirming offshore payments. My friend at the law firm, who'd been sitting 2 rows ahead under the pretense of being an investor, rose calmly and said into the mic, "These have been authenticated." The tone in his voice was not a question. A compliance officer stood beside him, ashen-faced, already pulling up internal audit systems. Then came Derek. I'd rehearsed this. A private conversation in front of a public room. I had a recording queued and a note slipped to Derek earlier that morning, reminding him that truth was easier than fear. He stood, voice trembling, and admitted, slowly, painfully, that he had altered numbers because Greg made me. The confession landed like an explosion. Cameras zoomed. Comments flooded the live chat. Greg's mask finally cracked. Panic rippled through the back channels. Phones vibrated. The CFO's eyes darted to his tablet. Matching transactions blinked on his screen. Someone whispered freeze, and that single word triggered a protocol I'd helped outline with counsel. Immediate hold on suspicious accounts pending investigation. Board members were already texting legal. The applause that had greeted Greg earlier turned into a desperate scramble to contain collateral damage. Greg stumbled toward the stage exit, a man suddenly 2 inches shorter. He tried to grab the microphone and spin a narrative. Instead, a compliance officer quietly read him his rights in corporate terms. Suspension effective immediately, assets under review, legal counsel notified. The office that once sheltered him became an arena of glass and exposure. In the lobby, a few family members who'd come to celebrate his promotion watched horrified as whispers and fragments of the emails played across phones, their faces drained of color. The social media monitors flagged the live stream. Within minutes, snippets of the emails were already circulating outside the company walls. The press call came faster than anyone expected. Investors demanded statements. Regulators were looped in by the compliance team. Greg's world, his accounts, his allies, his swagger, began to collapse under the weight of the documents I'd assembled. Security escorted him out, not with malice but with the cold efficiency of someone who knew this was no longer a scandal but a legal case. Standing there as the room tore itself apart, I felt a complex tide of satisfaction and emptiness. The mockery I'd endured had been replaced by a harder reality. The man who'd laughed at me now stood exposed, his career detonated by his own patterns. The crowd that once cheered him watched in stunned silence as HR announced an external audit and the company's intent to cooperate with authorities. When I finally left the building that night, it wasn't with giddy triumph. The streets smelled like rain, and the city lights looked less celebratory than indifferent. Messages poured in, some supportive, some fearful. I had pulled the cord. The stage had done the rest. Greg Holloway's empire had begun to crumble publicly, spectacularly and irretrievably. But as the sirens in the distance grew louder, a sliver of something I hadn't expected cut through the triumph. The knowledge that some doors, once opened, changed not just one life but many. The climax had come, and it was glorious and complicated. The morning after the fallout, the office felt eerily quiet. Greg Holloway's corner office, once a shrine to arrogance, now sat empty, Lights off, nameplate gone, and a small stack of his personal files waiting to be collected by HR. The echoes of his downfall lingered like smoke in the halls. Emails continued to circulate, audits were underway, and the board was still in emergency meetings. The empire he had built on manipulation and mockery had disintegrated, and everyone who had silently endured his games finally exhaled. For me, it was surreal. Sitting at my desk, I opened my laptop and reviewed the files one last time. The documents that had once caused sleepless nights now symbolized not just revenge, but liberation. I no longer felt the sting of ridicule or the weight of betrayal. The humiliation had been replaced by a sharp clarity. I was free. My ideas, my efforts, and my integrity were finally recognized, not co-opted by someone else. Colleagues approached cautiously at first, their expressions shifting from nervousness to admiration. "You handled it brilliantly," one whispered. "I had no idea you were compiling evidence for months." I smiled, but it was quiet, measured. I didn't need applause. Watching the dominoes fall, seeing Greg's own arrogance become his undoing, was reward enough. Life didn't pause for justice, but justice had found its stage. Greg's name, once associated with charm and authority, became synonymous with deceit and downfall. The media caught wind. Stories of his misappropriated funds and sabotage circulated, and the company's board vowed transparency moving forward. No amount of spin could save him now. In a way, the universe had its own perfect symmetry. The man who mocked others for perceived weaknesses had been undone by his own weaknesses, meticulously exposed. For me, it wasn't just revenge. It was a lesson in patience, vigilance, and self-belief. I realized that betrayal, while crushing, can ignite transformation. I had been pushed to the brink, but in that pressure, I discovered strategy, courage, and an unshakable resolve. My career didn't just recover, it flourished. Leadership noticed my composure under pressure, clients trusted me more, and even Derek, now free from fear, became an ally in future projects. And then, as I looked out the office window at the city lights, a strange satisfaction settled over me. Poetic justice isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, inevitable, and precise. Greg Holloway had spent years trying to diminish others to lift himself up, but in the end, his own actions toppled him. Every smirk, every slight, every attempt to humiliate me had become a stepping stone in his own downfall. If there's one truth I want viewers to take away, it's this: betrayal can feel like a cage, but sometimes the key is already in your hand, you just have to see it. Have you ever been mocked, undermined, or betrayed by someone you trusted? Share your story in the comments. Stand tall, strategize, and never let anyone's arrogance define your worth. And remember, the sweetest revenge isn't chaos. It's turning someone's own deception into the mirror of their destruction. Because in the end, the people who try to bury you often forget that the seeds they plant in your shadow grow into forests too strong to ignore. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of cunning, betrayal, and ultimate justice. Every story here reminds us that even the darkest manipulation can be illuminated by patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve.